SBC Media.
Welcome to iGaming Daily, analysing the news from the betting and gaming industry all over the globe. Supported by SBC Summit Barcelona, the industry-leading conference bringing you the future of sports betting and iGaming.
SBC Summit Barcelona is where you can experience the entire global industry coverage under one roof. Join 10,000 industry professionals for 3 days of game-changing conversation and education. Get your tickets now at sbcevents.com.
The off-season has been busy for sports leagues as they are all taking time to rethink how they approach their sports betting policies. This week, the NCAA revised its position on the subject for the first major post-PASPA changes. The NBA updated its CBA with respect to betting. And the NFL? Well, the NFL apparently has even more players to suspend for violating the betting policy. What do these changes look like? Who's handling them best? Who's handling them worst? We're going to tackle all of those questions and more on today's episode of iGaming Daily. I'm Jessica Welman, editor of SBC Americas, joined by my senior journalist, Charlie Horner. Charlie, how's your week been?
Yeah, it's been good. It's been good, thanks. Plenty of news. Yeah, how's yours been?
Plenty of news. You can go check SBC Americas. We have been cranking things out related to PointsBet and Fanatics. I know some of you probably expected us to hit that again today, but think the news coverage speaks for itself on that one. And I think we have to talk this new NCAA policy because I call it a little wackadoo. Charlie, if there was a word for you when you read the policy, what word would you give it?
I think in some quarters it's lenient.
They have made it more lenient. Like previously, you screw up in any way, shape, or form, you lose a season. At the minimum, you get kicked out at the maximum. And I will give the NCAA this, God bless them, their policy is much easier to understand than the NFL's and the NBA's, which is you are not allowed to bet, period. Which certainly makes sense given that your population is largely under the age of 21 of student athletes. You certainly have people with extra eligibility years and stuff that are 22, 23, but most of them, it's not even legal for them to bet. So those that are available or eligible to do so, they say, you're not allowed to bet on anything. Can't bet on ping pong, can't bet on your own sport, can't do anything. But Charlie, you were right. There's now this kind of range of options for what happens when people do bet that takes a bet on ping pong as the example. I don't believe there's collegiate ping pong, but I'm sure some listener can tweet and tell me if I'm wrong. That a single bet on that might, just lead to some education lessons. Whereas if you are betting on your own sport or influencing the outcome of a sporting event that you're in, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of the scope of your punishment. So, I think what's interesting is these are kind of the 3 rules that they put out. If you influence the outcome of an event or provide information, you're going to lose your potentially college eligibility for forever. If you wager on your own sport, but you're doing it about a different school than your own, there's a chance that you would get some amount of education and reinstatement, and maybe you lose half of one season of eligibility. And then here's the part where I think we're going to have a fun time talking about things. I'm just going to read this verbatim. For all other wagering-related violations, i.e. wagering on professional sports, the cumulative dollar value of the wagers will be taken into consideration with the following terms for reinstatement. $200 or less, you're going to get sports wagering rules and prevention education. $201 to $500, you're going to lose 10% of a season of eligibility. To put that in terms of American football, that's like one game, if even that, or a little more actually. $501 to $800, you're going to lose 20% of a season. More than $800, you're going to lose 30% of a season, and then rule education training. However, once you get over $800, staff at the NCAA is allowed to take into consideration if you need more punishment. So I had tweeted that it's kind of hilarious to me that an $801 of betting and $2 million of betting are being given the same punishment. But in fairness, they are allowed to be like, oh my God, you wagered $2 million. You're not allowed to go to school anymore. Still, what do you make of these numbers, Charlie? I think they seem arbitrary.
Yeah, I think they've probably categorized this and thought, well, we need some sort of tiered system. Let's just pick some numbers out of thin air. For me, I'm not necessarily sure whether the value of the wager should necessarily equate to the punishment, because, you know, maybe it should be volume of bets, what type of bets they are, how badly they might impact competition and that kind of thing, rather than the value, because, you know, rich kids are getting punished and more than the less well-off kids.
Exactly.
So it can create a lot of mixed messaging, I think.
I'm very curious how they decided that monetary value matters here. I don't know if some of that is just that the NCAA in general is kind of obsessed with student athletes having any sort of money. You know, you talk about like name, image, likeness deals. You talk about the things that they're allowed to accept, and these kinds of gifts and monetary values have to be of a certain amount, and they can't accept certain things. Some of this feels like those kinds of NCAA blinders on things, which is that we are very used to categorizing the monetary value of things in terms of how we punish people. I wholeheartedly agree with you, though, that I don't know if we're talking about a gradient of what's the worst situation. I really don't know how much the money, at least to me, is an indicator of how egregious the offense is. I don't know about you. When I was in school, $200 was an insane amount of money to me. You know, it would have been an enormous burden to me to lose $200. $800 was like an unheard of number in my head to just have sitting around. So you're right that for some people, like $200, if you're wagering $200 and you only have $300 in your bank account, that's a problem. If you're wagering $200 and your family has millions, then maybe it means nothing to you. I think more indicative, like you said, is if somebody is betting, if they bet 600 times over the course of their fall semester, that seems more problematic. Even if it was, I'm trying to do the math here, that would be, what, 30 cents a bet? If you were trying to keep it $200 or less. Why do I always try to do math on this podcast, by the way? You know.
But you're right. I think some kids could bet $1 200 times and get away with an education session. But then that's, you know, someone could place an $850 bet because they are a lot richer or their parents are a lot richer, and then they are out, you know, potentially for multiple games or miss an entire season or have their college place on the line. And again, I don't feel like the amount wagered should be the primary indicator of how egregious something is. I think it's, other factors, for me anyway, should take precedent.
Here's my question, I will say. First, props to the NCAA for understanding that the way things were was too harsh. You know, I don't know if you you don't follow football, so I'll tell you because I know you haven't heard. Alan Tisdale is a player at Virginia Tech who came back to school, saw that there was this sports wagering policy, realized he had violated it, went straight to his coach and said, hey, I bet on the NBA finals this summer. I bet, you know, X amount of money, and I won $41. I think it was like $400, and I won 41. His original punishment was a 9-game suspension. College football, you're usually playing like not 12 games. You play maybe like 10, 11 in a season. So essentially a full season, and it got reduced to 6. But that was for someone who was like, hey, I didn't know. I was betting on something completely different. I screwed up. He donated $41 to charity. I'm sure that charity was thrilled. And so I'm glad that they've done that. I don't love this policy, but what would we come up with that's better? that doesn't get really confusing.
I think you're right. I think, if you start being too arbitrary, it can get confusing, but I feel like the context of each case should be considered before a punishment should be given. I think the context of the wages, the amount of wages, the volume, how long a period of time this has gone on for, and what the proximity of the bettor to the fixture that they were betting on. I think all those things should be taken into consideration rather than just saying, oh, well, you bet $501, so you're out for 20% of the season, because each case is different.
Yeah, if I would just spitball, now that I'm kind of thinking through, hearing what you're saying, if there was kind of a rubric where there's 3 categories, there's money wagered, there's frequency, and then there's like duration, the period in which you were doing this. And, you check 2 out of the 3 boxes. There's categories. I think that might be a way that is still quantifiable, but also helps us understand the scope of things a little bit. Because, again, this Tisdale guy just got a training and was like, okay, I hadn't gotten this training before. I had missed, whatever messaging. My bad. If he had done this after that training, I feel like that's more egregious because you've had it hammered into your head that you're not supposed to do this. So I think it does kind of matter how much education you've had about it. Because if the first level of punishment is more education, well, the education didn't work the first time around. So it's an interesting one for sure. I am glad that they're taking steps, though, to expand these guidelines and accept that this is a very commonplace thing. There are certainly far more states with sports betting than without. It impacts student athletes. And I have a feeling it's going to impact these Iowa and Iowa State athletes. Charlie, for those who don't remember, we don't know a ton about what happened in Iowa, but what's the gist of what's gone on there?
So, yeah, there's up to 50 student athletes, I believe, who are at least under investigation and could have some sort of punishment for, breaking sports wagering rules. Like Jess said, we don't particularly know too much detail, but it's come around at a time when there's a lot of sort of betting breaches around college sports at the moment. We've spoken about it a few times on iGaming Daily, but yeah, there's this big investigation going on in Iowa, and I'm also wondering whether these rules have been brought in, specifically the date as well.
Exactly that. These are retroactive to May 2nd.
Whether it lines up.
And I believe it was right before SBC Summit, New Jersey, that we started hearing about these things in Iowa?
I think so. So potentially, the NCAA are looking at this and thinking, oh no, we're going to have to
kick out 50,
ban an entire
50
team. Maybe we should change the rules and maybe sort of reduce the punishments. I think maybe, without having my tin hat on too much, maybe that's something.
Yeah, I would say these dates are conspicuous enough to assume it's likely the Iowa State situation was involved. I think this also is an indication that schools are going to start taking this education piece much more seriously. We have an interview with Matthew Holt of US Integrity about Athlete Alert, and he was talking about going to places like the SEC conference and things like that, and getting buy-in from the athletic directors, from the deans, from these very high-level people to make sure that top all the way down to the athlete is super bought into. We're going to be very clear about what you can and can't do. We're going to be very clear, here's what happens when you do this, as flawed as it may seem. And we're going to put in place and make sure that all of you are getting educated on all of these things so that there's no plausible deniability that you just didn't know that you couldn't do this. I don't think we can say that for the NFL because Adam Schefter, who is, for those of you who are not American, he breaks all of the major NFL news these days for ESPN, broke the news that Isaiah Rodgers from the Colts is not going to be the only player suspended for violating the gambling policy. There are more coming this week. We just don't know who. And that seems to be the result of the NFL's betting policy is just confusing, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the NFL, like recently, I think it was last week, they had a conference call where they reinforced their betting rules, and there were essentially 6 key rules that all athletes have to follow. So that's don't bet on the NFL, don't gamble on team facilities, don't have someone bet on your behalf, don't share team insider information, don't enter a sports book during an NFL season, and then don't play daily fantasy sports. So yeah, there's 6 key rules there, but within those, it's, there's a few complexities. For instance, what about seasonal fantasy sports?
This is kind of like the card games that they don't want to get rid of because players would get upset. They've all been playing season-long DFS or season-long fantasy for a long time. You're going to pretend that it's for ego when in theory there's actually money involved. You have a problem with your policy if something is allowed to happen in your apartment, but it isn't allowed to happen in your car in the parking lot before you go to work.
Or even a little bit more silly than that. You could, you can't bet in the parking lot before work, but you can in the parking lot over the road from your training ground. It just feels a little bit confusing.
It's confusing, it's arbitrary, and I think that's what makes it very difficult to enforce, which is why I think you're going to see, the NFL seems to be doubling down on it. The NBA, on the other hand, they just updated their collective bargaining agreement with the Players Association, and they did have some rules as it pertains to sports betting that allow for very clear leeway of things that you are and aren't allowed to do. Lots of players are very eager to invest in companies. They want to get in on the sports betting craze, and they want to do more than just be a spokesperson. They want to be a stakeholder. That is allowed, but you are not allowed to own any more than 1% of a gambling company. And you are also allowed to do promotional deals related to sportsbooks as an active player, which is a change from previous policy. But you cannot depict that you are betting on the NBA or endorse betting on the NBA in any way. With both of these, I think I've jumped on this soapbox before in episodes. I find it weird that a player who is fresh out of college now can theoretically make a commercial with FanDuel telling people to bet March Madness, and they could do a whole campaign about like betting on your former team and cheering your team on, and this would all be fine within the letter of the law. But in the meantime, like, this person is probably speaking to all of these people regularly, know who's injured, knows what's going on, knows what's happening in the locker room. Like, to me, this is such a troubling concept that seems to be fine according to everyone else. Personally would love to see that gotten rid of in the MLB. You're not allowed to bet on any kind of baseball. I think that is a policy that makes a tremendous amount of sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think some of these situations, and they might be extreme situations, but they are realistic things that could happen and could threaten the integrity of some of these competitions and the bets around them. But on the other hand, I can see why these leagues are trying to offer a little bit of leeway within the rules, because sports betting has grown massively in the last 5 years. It's now a massive part of the sports ecosystem, and a lot of people around the age of these athletes, are engaging with these products all the time. You can see why athletes want to be associated with them. But then the leagues really don't want that, really closely associated with their own brand. So fine, if you want to bet on another sport, you can, but don't do it on our property, do it on your own property. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I can see where the league is coming from from that
I
regard.
also, like, why the NFL has not just called up GeoComply and said, I want you to fence these things and make it impossible to bet from them. Or even more simply, go to your, IT guy at the facility. Well, you can't do that because they're apps. They're not URLs. Just kidding.
But yeah, you're right. They could easily ring up GeoComply and ask for them to put a theoretical block around their facilities. Yeah, I think maybe you should get some commission on that deal.
I think other people have suggested it. Again, it comes back to what I think that some of the criticism about the NFL policy is like, you are making it the player's fault when, as a league, as a team, you could have very easily taken steps to make this not happen. Like, to make it impossible. Where, okay, we're going to geo-block it. You're not allowed to bet from here. Or we're going to turn in comprehensive lists of who is not allowed to bet to every regulator in the United States, and they are not allowed to open accounts with you. Or that they are only allowed to, that if they have an account, this is what they can't bet on. This is where they can't, there's so many ways for the leagues to be more collaborative about this. I say the leagues, I'm going to say the NFL, because we haven't seen these issues coming up with other people. And I don't think they're being as proactive as they could be about it. Of course, when has the NFL been proactive about anything? On that note, we mentioned the Fanatic stuff. Anything else going on this week at SBC Americas people need to know about?
Oh, yeah, we've got a couple of interesting bills coming out of Canada this week, actually. So Senator Scott Tannis wants First Nations to have more rights with regards to the gaming industry in Ontario. So if there's any movement on that bill, we will certainly keep you up to date on SBC Americas. And I'm sure Nick Ware will keep you up to date over on CanadianGamingBusiness.com.
Yes, go
as well.
check out CGB. We'll get Nick on here soon to talk about some of these bills. I'm going to also say very curious things happening in New Jersey right now. Online casino, 10 years old. It's set to, the original agreement to allow it is set to expire in November. There was a bill to just automatically renew it for another 10 years. And that bill suddenly got revised down to 2 years. And now we're hearing the middle ground might be 5 years. What's not being publicly stated is why there is not a desire to kind of fist bump and get excited and push this through for another 10 years. So we're following that. I'm hearing whispers I'm not allowed to talk about just yet, but keep your eyes and ears out as that develops, and we'll probably end up talking about it here on iGaming Daily in the future. So be sure to check us out next time.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of iGaming Daily, brought to you in conjunction with SBC Summit Barcelona, being held at the Fira Barcelona Montjuic on the 19th to the 21st of September. If you want to find out more about some of the subjects raised today, feel free to explore any of the sites in the SBC News Network, or check out the latest edition of the SBC Leaders magazine. Happy reading.